AM 630.
WMAL.
7:06 on WMAL, where Washington comes to talk. I'm Brian Wilson. He's Brian Neiman. Good to have you along on this Thursday morning. There was a couple of days ago, there was some questions about what was going on with Kwame Brown, the D.C. Council chair. Was he going to resign? Some people seem to think he would. He said he would not, but he did. Yesterday, he resigned from that office after it was announced that he was going to be charged, and apparently he's going to plead guilty to one count of bank fraud. Del Wilber with the Washington Post has been doing some great reporting on this particular story, and he's on the line right now to talk more about it. Del, how are you?
Hey, how are you doing?
All right, so give us the background on what's really going on here. So, and was there a meeting, or was there not a meeting in which the prosecutors sort of laid out for Kwame Brown and for his lawyers what they had against him?
Well, that's usually what happens in these cases. The prosecutors call in. I know that they've been in negotiations or discussions for weeks talking about how to resolve this issue, and if prosecutors feel comfortable enough charging you in a criminal information, which is this document that can only be filed with the defendant's consent and basically means you're going to plead guilty, they could also indict you. And so they had gathered a lot of material, and what's interesting, though, is that most people have been paying attention to discrepancies in this 2008 campaign. Remember, there were more than $200,000 of unaccounted for money raised and spent, and a lot of money went to his brother's
consulting business,
which is always kind of shady, right?
Yep.
And so they're looking into that. But meanwhile, and the Post did a lot of great stories about this in 2010. The guy was had all these crazy mortgages on his house, and he got a big loan to buy a boat called Bulletproof, and so. Which I find funny.
Yes.
So he buys all these things, and that's where they get you. I was recently reading that story that Mike DeBonis did back in 2010, because some people say, it's not going to be. Some sources were telling me it was not going to be about the 2008 campaign. These charges were related to his personal finances. And I read that story. I was like, oh my gosh, there's four potential federal crimes in this one story, because there's credit card stuff, there's this, there's wire stuff, there's bank stuff, there's mortgage stuff, and if they wanted to, they probably could have gotten him on a Coast Guard violation related to the boat.
Oh, really?
Really?
If they wanted to. And so, I think that's probably what was laid out. And it was a guy who was $700,000 in debt as early as 2010. That's Kwame Brown.
Right.
Probably was like, ooh, how do I finance a legal defense? I don't know how you do that.
Well, let me ask you a question on this. They were looking at the 2008 campaign. Is that still another shoe that could drop, or was there sort of look, Kwame, if you just resign, this will all go away? Is that the deal they cut privately?
I'm not privy to the private discussions, but I imagine that they usually go down somewhat like that. They usually say, here's our evidence, here's our offer. The defense comes back and says, here's what we'll be willing to plead to, because in the defense's mind, they're worried about sentencing guideline ranges, and if the prosecutors want mortgage fraud and bank fraud, that would make his guideline range not 12 to 18 months, but 24 to 36 months. And, Kwame Brown doesn't want to spend 36 months potentially in federal prison. And, and so that's probably how it went.
Was he really $700,000 in debt? And how?
Yeah.
Do we know how he got into that much debt?
Yeah, because he kept taking out loans on his house during the heyday of the market and buying stuff. He had a real penchant for expensive cars, even city-owned ones. Remember when he first took office, he got the city to lease a fully loaded, really expensive sport utility vehicle.
Right.
Drive around town, and so, he buys a $50,000, 38-foot powerboat. In the height of the financial crisis. I don't know why anyone, that's what he was doing, and so. You get into trouble that way.
The Post reported several years ago that he had he said the value of his home was $850,000.
Yes.
But the assessment was only $350,000.
Yes, and that's what I found. That's what's part of the stuff I was talking about earlier. Is that when the Feds start looking into this, all the hoopla or whatever was about his 2008 campaign, which had so many discrepancies that the city, financial or the city campaign finance office referred it to federal prosecutors. But when you start going to the guy's personal finances, and you start digging through this stuff, all these different mortgage applications and everything, when these sources were telling me about this, I couldn't figure out, in this one story and a couple stories laying out all these problems, I couldn't pick which would be the better federal crime.
Well, as the chairman, he has obviously the ability to put things in front of the city council. Is there any investigation into what he decided when in front of the council? And also, I mean, back to the brother situation and this campaign money that just was never reported. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, right?
Right.
That was never reported, and his brother's consulting firm got a lot of that money. Is that brother under investigation, and is it possible, hey, that he used campaign money, funneled it to his brother, the brother gave it back to him, and he used it to pay off some debt?
Well, I mean, that's always a potential what they're looking into. We haven't reported yet where that money, the tracking of that money, but that the feds have said they're still investigating the campaign, and I know. There was a grand jury investigation in looking into it. So I suspect we have not heard the last about this. And also, what you plead to at times is very limited. Like, I'll plead to bank fraud. But when the government enters the statement of offense in his plea deal on Friday, it may be much bigger than that. It may be like laying out a whole gamut of things that he's agreed he committed, but in agreeing that he committed those offenses, he's only pleading guilty to one crime. And prosecutors may have agreed to that because, when you look at the sentencing guideline range, what you can get out of it and everything, and what you could actually prove at trial, and the risks of going to trial with a popular, D.C. politician. And
with a D.C. jury.
With a D.C. jury, I mean, just because they're local residents, he may know people, he may have helped people. It's, it's just very difficult. Trials are by nature difficult.
And expensive.
And so they may have looked, although that hasn't stopped the Roger Clemens prosecution. But but if you look at the two, those are what they're aiming for. And so people, they only got him on bank fraud. Well, if you threw in all the other things, and the D.C. crimes are strangely, like we remember a couple weeks ago when those two guys pleaded guilty who worked for Vincent Gray. One, they're both felonies. They were both charged with cover-ups, lying to the investigators in the investigation of the campaign problems. But the only underlying charge that they got them on related to the actual campaign were misdemeanors, D.C. misdemeanors, which carried only a maximum penalty of 6 months in jail. And so a lot of these D.C. campaign violations, you can't even get into federal court. And so, who knows?
I think there was a wink and a nod, and I think there was that, look, if you just walk away from the council.
Yeah, but they can't necessarily force him to resign either.
But they can also say, or we can go another route.
Well, I think that's how these all go. I mean, they don't. It's no use going to someone and saying to the defendant, "Hey, we want you to plead guilty. We think you did this." They're gonna be like, "Prove it." But if you go to them and say, throw your papers on the table and say, "We have you on these 15 things, on these 20 things. You want to go to trial? Be my guest. But here's the deal we'll offer you."
All right, real quick on the Clemens trial, because I know you haven't covered it. Brian McNamee, the trainer who is the one who says that he kept all of these, needles and stuff to make sure that he wasn't going to be the fall guy for Clemens. His wife testified yesterday or recently, and she basically contradicted his story, right?
Yeah, some of it. Unfortunately, I missed some of it yesterday, but, it's in the same courthouse. And so what happened was, Brian McNamee says, I kept all this stuff, the needles and gauze and disgusting things and this thing that he used on Clemens and other ball players to keep his wife quiet. She was nagging him, harping on him. He couldn't stand it anymore. He said, "Look, you got to give me some room. Look what I'm involved in. Look, I kept it all." And she went, "Oh, okay." Well, she comes on the stand and says, "Huh? I didn't even know about this stuff till later." Yeah. And she's like this, dressed in this blueprint dress. She's a school teacher, It's like, who do you believe? And they've already it's funny. This judge allows jurors to ask questions, right? And one of the questions one juror wanted to ask of Brian McNamee was, "How can we believe your testimony when it has so many inconsistencies?"
That's not a good sign.
No. And so, but I've never been correct in predicting a jury outcome, and I won't do it today.
All right. Sounds good, Dale. We'll talk to you down the road. It's always a pleasure to have you on. Thanks very much.
All right. Thanks, man.
Del Wilber from the Washington Post joining us about Kwame Brown, also following the Clemens trial. 7:15 on 105.9 FM and AM 630 WMAL. Wilson will run down the numbers and show you why it's really not cost-effective to have a electric car these days.